Okay, so why don't we get started? I'm going to turn it over to Tim Driver and Jan Mutchler. Jan, I guess, worked with, well, we used to be New Jersey Foundation, but worked with us way back developing the Elder Economic Security Index for New Jersey. And Tim is from the Age Friendly Institute in Boston, and we are partnering with him, which I will start on Monday, as soon as I'm done this, to bring the Certified Age Friendly Employer Program to New Jersey, the CAFE program. Great acronym. But, you know, one of the things that we really have to look at is, as we are living longer, how do we pay for living longer, and what will it cost us? So I will turn it over to both of you.
Super, thank you. This is a little weird. The only person I can see is Tim. So Kathy, if people have questions as I'm going along, please just you know, let me know. Free to jump in. Okay.
So if you in the audience have questions, just raise your hand and I'll relay the question.
Super, thank you. Okay, so anyway, I am very happy to be with you today and to talk about this work. And I'm especially happy to be talking about this topic. It's such an important topic, as Kathy laid out. And my goal for today is really to just give you some background on the intersection of demographic change. And part of that, of course, is living longer, as well as financial security in later life and how that connects with retirement. So I'm going to share my screen, and can you see that? Okay.
Yep.
Super, great. Okay. Along the way, you know, as Kathy mentioned, I've been working on the Elder Index for a long time. New Jersey is a leader in the Elder Index, and so I'll be talking about that, the latest data for New Jersey as well. I'm going to start by noting that a large majority of us are living beyond our so-called retirement age. In 2020, expectation of life was 77. What's important about that number is that people often don't really understand what expectation of life is. And what that means is that babies that were born in 2020 could expect to live about to age 77 on average, if nothing changed. So that's for us, for those of us who are already in midlife or older, that maybe is not such a relevant number. People who were already age 65 in 2020, those who had already survived to that age, could expect to live another 19 or 20 years. And so what that means is that at the time that many of us are reaching standard retirement age, at this time, we can be expecting to live a couple of decades beyond that. So that's a lot of retirement years ahead of us. And if we put off starting to plan for retirement until our, you know, maybe our 50s, until our kids were out of the house, or maybe till we had made a bigger dent in our mortgage, then we really don't have very much time to continue to plan for those decades of retirement. So, you know, it's important, of course, to remember that living longer is a good thing. It's great when expectation of life increases and that people can expect to have a long life. But the result of that positive trend has a financial downside for many of us. As we get older, we experience increased risk of losing a spouse, for instance. And once we've lost a spouse, we can really experience some financial hardships that were much more substantial than when we were younger and had that spouse in place. As well as we get older, we have a higher risk of chronic health conditions. And along with those conditions might be medications or health care that is quite expensive. So we can have a lot more expenses than we did in the past, and we may have fewer resources to pay for them. And this doesn't even talk about long-term services and supports, which we all know is very expensive, and that can be a big problem for us as well. The consequences of not having enough money to get by in retirement can be very extreme. This is a picture from an article that Rob Wiseman put in the Globe. He's somebody who writes in the Boston Globe quite a bit about older people. He talked about how financial shortfalls impact older Boston residents. This story really profiled a number of different couples and singles and talked about how they struggle to make ends meet. The people who were featured in this piece were doing the very best they could to get by on limited incomes, to make those incomes stretch. But of course, sometimes that meant they weren't taking medications that they should be taking. It meant that they weren't eating enough. They weren't cooling or heating their homes adequately, or maybe not even paying their rent on time. And so these kinds of stories are very familiar to probably everybody on your side of the screen here. I think anybody who works with older adults, or frankly, who even knows any older adults who is an older adult themselves, they're familiar with these kinds of stories of people really being pinched financially and having to make accommodations that are not good and not healthy. This is true throughout the entire United States. You're not going to find a community anywhere in the country where there aren't stories like this going on. But in New Jersey, where cost of living is high, the problem at any age, so this is a general figure, at any age, this balance between resources and expenses matters. This is how we summarize financial security. This figure actually demonstrates financial insecurity. That's the situation where the expenses that we have really outstrip the resources that we have. For most older people in the US, the resources side of the equation is heavily weighted on Social Security. Most people in the US have Social Security, and that is the largest part of their retirement income for many, many people. But Social Security alone isn't enough to cover necessary expenses. And people always talk about, well, Social Security wasn't intended to cover everybody's expenses. It's like, well, that may be true, but it's still a problem. It's still a problem that Social Security is low relative to what people need to get by. Some people do have pensions. They might have savings. They might have investments. And for some people, a not inconsequential number of people, that's enough. That's enough to cover their necessary expenses. But for many, many people, more resources are necessary. The Elder Index is a tool that lets us measure the necessary expenses so that we can get a better assessment or a better gauge of how those resources and expenses balance out. We build the Elder Index around a market basket of everyday expenses that people encounter when they're 65 and older. It's a bare bones budget. It includes nothing beyond the essentials. It assumes that people pay for everything out of pocket. It assumes they're living independently. We focus just on people who are living alone or people who are living in a two-person household, both of whom are 65 and over. Very importantly, we calculate this county by county for the entire United States. So it factors in that geographic difference in cost of living. And at UMass Boston, we've been calculating the Elder Index for more than a decade. In New Jersey, we've actually been doing it for more like 15 years. And so some of you that have been around for a while in this space are probably pretty familiar with the Elder Index. What I'm showing you here is the Elder Index for New Jersey for 2022. So this is the statewide average for New Jersey. As I said, we calculate it for every county in the United States. And this is what we get when we just generate a weighted average across all of the counties in New Jersey. As you can see here, we calculate it separately for older people living alone as well as older couples. We calculate it for 3 different housing scenarios, one being owners without a mortgage, the other being renters or owners with a mortgage. We calculate the Elder Index by separately estimating housing, food, transportation, healthcare, and miscellaneous expenses. We add them up for a monthly budget and we multiply it by 12 for an annual budget. So as you can see here, the New Jersey average Elder Index ranges from just under $31,000 a year if we're assuming a single person who owns their home and the mortgage is all paid off, all the way up to $57,000 a year if we're assuming a couple, 2 older people living independently, they're owners, homeowners, and they still have a mortgage. You will not be surprised to know that the Elder Index is high in New Jersey. I think this is probably one of the things that motivated New Jersey to start looking at the Elder Index and looking for a measure like the Elder Index from the very beginning. Here, all I'm showing you is the numbers for singles living alone. Okay, so we've just simplified things, but you can find the numbers for all of the different scenarios on our website. So we're just looking at singles who are owners with no mortgage living alone on the left side. The first bar is for New Jersey and the second is for US as a whole in that scenario. And then on the right, we're assuming that people are single renters. Again, looking at New Jersey and the US. And what you can see right away very clearly is that the cost of living is much higher in New Jersey than in the US on average. And actually, when we look at the state rankings, we see that New Jersey is the 6th most expensive state. And that's right behind Massachusetts, which is number 1. Yay, we're number 1. The very most expensive state in these scenarios is Massachusetts, followed by Hawaii, New York, California, Maryland, and then New Jersey. Okay. And it's also very easy to see that the main action here in terms of what's driving those expenses is housing. So the cost of housing is far and away the biggest part of the elder index in most communities, in most locations. And it's certainly the biggest part of variability from one location to another. The last thing I want to point out here from this figure, you can see over here what I've illustrated is where does the federal poverty line fall? You know, we're very used to be talking about the federal poverty line as signifying, you know, here we're talking about people who are in trouble. If they're living below the poverty line, they're really struggling. They're financially insecure. They're having a hard time of it. This figure illustrates how low the federal poverty line, that metric that we're so familiar with, is relative to what it really takes to get by, which is the elder index. So the message here is that financial security requires a lot more income than staying above the federal poverty line does. Okay, so, and that's especially in places like New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, places where the cost of living is quite high. I'm going to turn and just share a couple of figures about what percentage of people in New Jersey have incomes below the elder index. Okay, so we calculate these figures by summarizing the income that people have and comparing that to what it takes to get by according to the elder index. And what we find is that many older adults in New Jersey do fall short of financial security, do have incomes below the elder index. Singles are especially at risk, and single women are at especially high risk of having incomes that fall below the elder index. So 51%, just over half of single women living alone have incomes below the elder index. And here the reference point we're using is for renters, the value for renters. 43% of single men and 20% of couples have incomes below the elder index. We also see substantial disparities across race and ethnic categories. People of color are at especially high risk of financial insecurity. These figures, again, are for singles living alone in New Jersey. And it shows that older people who are Black or Asian or Latinx have considerably higher rates of financial insecurity than their white counterparts do. So disparities in financial security across New Jersey are substantial. It's not just New Jersey. It's true in every state throughout the country. But these are what the figures look like in New Jersey, and we can see a lot of disparities. So we're seeing women, again, much higher risk than men of being financially insecure, people of color having much higher risk of being financially insecure. And I'm not sharing the numbers here, but we also find that as people get older, so when we are looking at people in their late 70s and their 80s, that risk just continues to escalate. So the oldest old, what we would call them in some audiences, are at especially high risk. I would like to return to the question of Social Security, the importance of Social Security in retirement. It's really important to have this conversation because, again, retirement security really has a lot to do. Social security benefits get people part of the way towards financial security. And so it's important to include that. The average Social Security benefit for a retired worker in the US as a whole is just under $20,000 a year. In New Jersey, it's a little bit higher, about $22,000 a year. And when we compare that to that federal poverty threshold, which again is very low, $14,000 a year, we see how people talk so often about how Social Security pulls people out of poverty. And that's absolutely true. There are a lot of people who would be truly destitute if it were not for Social Security benefits. But at the same time, we have to remind ourselves that the federal poverty threshold is extraordinarily low. That truly is a destitute level income, $14,000. The other piece of the thing to remember about the federal poverty threshold is that it's the same everywhere in the country. And so that does not take into account any difference in cost of living across counties or communities or states. When we plug in the elder index to this comparison, we can see that a social security benefit doesn't yield retirement security on its own. And this is true everywhere in the US, but it's especially concerning in higher cost areas like New Jersey. On average in the US, as well as in New Jersey, when we compare the average Social Security benefit to the cost of living, the elder index for a single renter, we see that Social Security benefit covers about 2/3 of the necessary expenses. So that leaves about 1/3 of the remaining necessary costs to be covered in some other way, something beyond Social Security. And the dollar amount that comes to is about $9,000 in the US on average, and about closer to 10.5, almost $11,000 for New Jersey as a whole. So the gap is substantial, and that gap is going to make a big difference in terms of people being able to pay for their medications, buy healthy food, pay for their rent. Finally, getting to the working part of the conversation. People who work longer can provide greater financial security for themselves and their families. So people who work longer can put off taking their Social Security benefits. And as we know, when you wait longer to start taking your Social Security benefits, you will end up getting a benefit that is increased for the rest of your life. So it can be a very beneficial, financially beneficial move for people to put off taking their Social Security benefits. They also have longer time periods to add to their retirement savings, perhaps add to the base amount of their benefits as well. And all else equal, working longer can shorten the amount of time that those savings need to last. If you reflect back again on that 20-year or longer time period that we may have between the time that we would conventionally retire, maybe around age 65, and how long we can expect to live beyond that. We shorten that time period, our resources are going to last longer. And as well, we shouldn't forget that there is research that also supports the notion of working longer having other benefits. It can actually help our health. It can help our cognitive performance, our cognitive health. We can maintain our social network. So there are a lot of good reasons to continue working if we can. And in fact, we do see that there's a trend toward working longer. This figure shows average retirement age for men on the top in blue and for women on the bottom in orange. You can see the women's retirement age has increased dramatically along with everything else about women's work, that there's just been more and more involvement in work by women for many decades. In 1962, the average age of retirement for men was up here at nearly 66 years, and you can see it dropped off steadily into the 1980s, but now it's been increasing gradually again. And so we do see that turning upwards and people starting to stay in the workforce a little bit longer. Again, women's that pattern is just part of a general trajectory upward in terms of work and delay of retirement. They do retire about 4 years, 2 or 3 years later than men on average. So it might be that some people are in fact staying in the workforce longer in order to maximize their Social Security benefits. They may be aware of that issue and they may be sticking around in order to increase their Social Security benefits. But other factors have also played a role. People might be staying at work longer because of current financial pressures that extend into later life. So for instance, this figure talks about the demise of defined retirement plans and the fact that for baby boomers, their fathers, many of them did have defined benefit plans, but for people born in the 50s and onward, having a defined benefit plan is very unusual, unlikely. So financial security for these folks is going to depend heavily on Social Security, but also on access to other retirement savings programs, things like defined contribution plans, savings, investments, things of that nature. In addition, employers are increasingly unlikely to offer retiree health benefits. And that means if people want to continue up to Medicare eligibility, then they need to stay working and having access to their employer benefits because they're unlikely to have it in retirement. And as well, I think that there's not a systematic literature about this, but I think that there's just been a general movement of people carrying kind of midlife financial responsibilities into later life. And so I think if we look around us and maybe in our own lives, we know that many of us in our early or mid 60s are still having some financial responsibility for our children or our grandchildren, perhaps. Many of us still are paying off a house. We don't want to retire until we've paid off that house, perhaps. And many of us are carrying a lot of debt into later life. And so those sort of midlife problems are increasingly becoming later life problems. And that might prompt people to work a little bit longer and stay in the workforce. So I think it's clear from all of this that the need for people to continue working if they can is there. Many of us would benefit from working into our late 60s or even our early 70s because of these financial pressures. This isn't going to be feasible for everyone. There are people who can no longer work. They can't work that long, but working longer is an option for many of us. We are reaching life in better health on average. We have better mobility, better cognitive well-being, and we're bringing a whole lot of human capital into later life with us. And so I think that there is the potential for working longer, and a lot of people are discovering that and, in fact, putting off retirement. Before I turn it over, I'd just like to thank our funders and partners, some of whom are located in New Jersey. So thanks to Silver Century and RF Foundation for Aging and the NJAAW Foundation, and also NCOA. And I will share my slides so that Kathy can share them with you, but I do invite you to come to our website and learn more about the Elder Index. I will stop sharing and pass it back to you, Kathy.
Does anybody have any questions for Jan? Yes.
So I know I've seen this pattern. They decided to try to they made more than they were allowed to and few product prices. So they go to 2 hours.
Could you hear that, Jan?
Could not, no, sorry.
Okay, so she was saying that she knows a lot of seniors who went back to work, but then were penalized by Social Security. So, okay, it goes to a certain age and then you can make however much, you're not penalized. But so they retired, went back and were financially penalized. So I wonder in the net, did they come out ahead or behind by working? You know?
I think at the time.
Okay.
67.
So, so if you go back until you're 67, up to 14,000, you basically lose $2 for every dollar you earn.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of issues with respect to returning to work. I think in general, things often work better if people are able to just remain at work rather than trying to come back. But I think there's still, even for people who have taken early retirement, for instance, and realized that it really wasn't financially sustainable, or that they just wanted to come back to work for other reasons, I think in the long run, it can be a beneficial thing.
Another question over here. Sure. So do you have an opinion, and this might actually be a question for Tim later, on part-time work, to transition to part-time work instead of retiring completely or retiring and then going back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll be interested to hear what Tim says about that as well. But I do think that can be a good thing. I think that there's been decades of people who've sort of taken those transitional positions, maybe pulled back in their current job to a part-time basis, or taken a different bridge job altogether. And that can, you can realize a lot of the advantages of continued work without entirely, turning your life over to it. And so I think that there are a lot of good things about that, certainly.
Okay.
Start growing,
Do you find that people are working while drawing from their Social Security and saving it? So they still have their salary, but then begin collecting Social Security on top of it?
I don't have any information on that. That's a good question, but I have not looked at that.
And I'm wondering too, if they did that compared to your question, is it a difference if they stopped collecting Social Security and then went back to work, or if they postponed collecting Social Security, what the difference is? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's interesting again. Okay, one more.
mentioned what we ended up doing is speaking to residents, or with a lot of looking, let them know that you call Social Security first, find out how much you actually do.
Interesting.
Another issue that we found was they were taking jobs, but they weren't reporting into the office. So they had to pay the back, the cut thing.
Oh,
So, it's just good to kind of some preventative stuff. If you can, and they kind of in situations that are rolling. We got this session and talk to these folks that but they don't know.
yeah.
So this we just try to, equip them beforehand. But we've had several people had, come to my office just doing resident service. They weren't,
Yeah.
they were getting jobs because they had debt trying to pay all the bills.
Right.
They ended up being because they had to pay them back money.
That is interesting. So I don't know if you could hear that, but in residence in her building, they suggest call Social Security beforehand, so you know what you can make up to what level, to face that same thing, at what level you're penalized, but also working and not reporting it. And then when it is found out, you have to pay up the difference and pay the taxes on it. But that can also affect other benefits if they have housing subsidies or anything else. Yeah. All right. 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 So research beforehand, so you don't actually end up financially behind by working. So one more last question, then we'll go on to Tim.
And that's continue to work, not stop.
So if you can collect your spouse's, a deceased spouse's social security. Was it deceased spouses or the spouse could be living too? This, then, and be able to work. So it sounds like you really have to research
Yes.
what the deductions. They don't think of it beforehand. Yeah. Interesting.
Mhm.
So,
A lot of
interesting.
moving pieces, a lot of
Yeah.
moving, but you're absolutely right. It's
Right.
it's or something that almost everybody's eligible for. It's amazing how complicated it is. So finding good advice on
Right.
that.
Okay, so let's turn this over to Tim. You want to take over the share screen?
Sure, I'll do that. And first of all, thank you very much for the privilege of speaking this afternoon with you. And I might just start with picking up with those questions, since there were a number of them about the impact of a so-called retirement job on your Social Security. And I'm going to just share my screen, and I'll put a link in the chat too, in case it's something you can share. But this is a piece on retirementjobs.com. The information is also available through the Social Security Administration. But in general, the conventional wisdom is that you would want, Uncle Sam would like you to work if you, but not penalize you. In general, there's sort of an incentive built in here, and so you will not be penalized up until a certain point, and then obviously this number changes based on your when you claim Social Security. So there's incentives in here to work. There's also incentives in here to take Social Security later. And I think the conventional wisdom is that for most people, taking Social Security later is a good thing. Of course, there's exceptions, and it's worth consulting with a financial advisor to know if you are one of those exceptions. But as a general rule, this is what Uncle Sam is encouraging you, not you, but the older citizens in New Jersey that we're speaking about here. I'm going to pick up and talk about sort of this working longer topic from the other perspective, that to sort of complement what Jan has spoken about, which is sort of the economic side. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about just sort of the why and the how. And I think Jan has touched a lot on the why. I'm going to talk a lot on the how. And the upshot here really is that it needs to be easier to do this, but it is getting a little bit easier. And one of our goals here at the Age Friendly Institute is to accelerate that and make it increasingly easy. And working with Kathy and her organization is just another way to do that, by encouraging employers to become more age friendly and really embrace this idea that working longer is good for people. Jan mentioned it's good on the economic side, but there's other benefits to individuals. And I'm going to speak a little bit here too about why it's not just about benefiting individuals, but it's also about benefiting employers, and it's about benefiting our society. So you'll see how we sort of position that a little bit. And our sort of first thesis here is that working longer solves almost everything. And of course, that's a little bit tongue in cheek because there's a lot of problems in the world. But the point of the matter here is this is not just about older New Jersey residents. It's about New Jersey and the United States and the employers within New Jersey. This is something that, when done right, is good for all. The information I'm going to talk about here is drawn mostly from surveys and research that we conduct here. We talk to hundreds of employers around the country. So this is not just about New Jersey, but it's about, lots and lots of employers. I would say most of our research does skew to larger companies, because those are the ones that have become quicker to embrace sort of the research side of this. Having said that, I will also make the point that, age bias is real for a lot of people. And one of our goals is to help people navigate around age bias. I would say one of the shortcomings in our research, and something that we're trying to address as we get bigger and better at this, is to actually tap into the sentiments of smaller employers more. Because anecdotally, I can say, having done this for almost 20 years now, anecdotally, we see age bias to be less acute in smaller employers, where oftentimes you have more of a sort of a family atmosphere, and there's greater relationships that have developed, and therefore a greater loyalty. I'll also talk a little bit about who are these older workers, these adult workers we're talking about, and then I'm going to ask you if you know a slungo, and of course I'll tell you what a slungo means when I get there. A little background on the Age Friendly Institute. I'm really going to focus my attention, my discussion here today, on the center box there, which is about a program we've run for almost 20 years, where we identify employers that are more likely to welcome an older adult worker than to shun them. And unfortunately, the shunning does still happen out there. As I said, these are the sort of three perspectives I'm gonna touch on. Why is this good for older adults? Again, picking up on what Jan said, when you're working, you're more engaged. And when you're more engaged, you're generally a healthier person, both physically and mentally. And then, of course, you're more economically secure. So we talk a lot, and the researchers around the world who are studying the older adult population talk a lot about, the perils of social isolation. And, one of the antidotes to that is people being re-engaged through work, or staying engaged through work. And that graph that Jan showed you of, it used to be that the labor force participation rate for men at older ages was really high. And then introduced was this thing called Social Security. The age came down. And then in the mid to late 80s, it sort of bottomed out, and it's been climbing back ever since. And, I view that, for the reasons on the slide here, as a good thing. I think it's, it's generally a good thing for people to be in the workforce longer. And the good news is there's a greater acceptance rate going on for a bunch of reasons that I'm going to get into now. Let me just. Here's just an example. We did some research for the University of Pennsylvania, just to point out this point. Like, if you are working, you are going to be 4 times more socially engaged than if you're not. And this is sort of just a way of quantifying what I just said. And it's sort of like something that most people know, but when you start to quantify it and look at it this way, you can start to measure, how much happier are people when they are back working, no matter where it is, if they're engaged or re-engaged, versus the opposite of, staying at home, discouraged because you can't find work perhaps, or you feel like you're not welcomed in the workplace any longer, and you're therefore, watching reruns of I Love Lucy all day long. It's not healthy to be doing that. As good a show as I Love Lucy might be, it's not where you need to be. Involuntary retirement is something that's not really well understood, but it is something that we study, and it's directly associated with poorer health, both physically and mentally. And a lot of the people who come to the website that we operate, called retirementjobs.com, which is a national job site for people over 50, they report they report to us in our surveys on this negative association between involuntary retirement and bad health. And I would say it's, as I said, it's not well known how many people are in retirement because they want to be in retirement. There's a lot of people who are in retirement because they landed there, not out of their own choice, but because of somebody else's direction, and employer saying, it's time for you to move on. This is the consumer sentiment out there about whether age bias is a fact of life in the workplace. And, back when we started this index many years ago, it was almost everybody. It's gotten just a tiny bit better, but, there's a lot of work to be done here still on convincing mostly employers that there's a benefit to bringing on older workers. I will say that COVID helped a little bit here. One of the challenges, and there's always this challenge within a company, who should bring up the retirement question? Is it the HR department or the employer, or is it the employee? And in reality, both sides are a little nervous about bringing up this topic, because if you're on the HR side, you might expose yourself to an age bias lawsuit. If you're on the employee side, you might sort of say to your boss, well, I'm a little bit less involved or interested in staying engaged for the long term. And all of a sudden you put yourself in a different spot. But the reason why many older adults didn't ask their boss about part-time work and retirement, which came up earlier in Jan's presentation, the reason that people didn't ask this question was because they didn't think their boss would allow it. They didn't think remote work or flexible work was going to be permitted. But guess what? The minds have been changed on this, and it's not like, the jury is still out on where this is all going to end up. But I think we can all conclude after COVID that the acceptance by employers of people working remotely is far higher than it ever was in the last quarter century. Jan also mentioned, and here's some data to support that, is that people, based on that acceptance of employers of working flexibly, people are saying, well, gosh, if I can work remotely, maybe that's mornings, or maybe it's 4 days a week, or maybe it's remote, that might change my entire outlook on retirement. And I may be willing to delay retirement. And what people are telling us is they're 65% of the time willing to delay their retirement up to 5 years. Interestingly, when we do survey work on what do people want in a retirement job, people say they want something new. And that's interesting. This is a different life stage. What we hear from people is, maybe not surprisingly, they value their time differently than they did earlier in their career, where maybe earlier on it was really about, getting as much money in the bank to pay for tuitions and, cost of living, increases being, what they are. It's expensive to live, but when people have left, children have left the house, costs go down a little bit, and maybe the values or the needs associated with work become a little bit different. So, and then there's also age bias to consider. People want to go where they're wanted, and they tend to not want to go where they're not wanted. And so they start looking for what we refer to as age-friendly employers. So now let's look at it from the employer's perspective. What do they need? They need talent, newsflash, there's a talent shortage out there. They also need good results. And some of the things that are going on as we speak that have been a major boon to older workers are, you've got the rise in the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which more often than not now includes age. Not every employer is looking at it, and certainly it doesn't rank as high as some of the other segments within diversity, but it's very much on the radar. And most of these now staffed up diversity staffs are looking at age as as being included in the definition of diversity. And Wall Street needs and demands a diversity answer from companies. So guess what? Now, all of a sudden, this topic of older workers is not just important to the HR department in a big company, it's also important to the C-suite. And that's a really important thing, because when we started our cafe program, a while back, we had a good audience with HR departments, but it didn't always get beyond them. And now the C-suite is paying more attention. Retention, talent acquisition, and then I'll talk a little bit about customer satisfaction and some of the drivers for employers. Here's a quote from Starbucks on the topic of retention. They became a certified age-friendly employer and blasted this message to the world, their world, not because they had a problem finding people, but because they have a problem keeping people. And they wanted to send an explicit message to their older staff that we want you to stay. We're not expecting that when you get to a certain age that it's time to pack your bags and hit the road. And this is something that's echoed by many employers who are smart, who are, the ones especially that have churn or, turnover problems. They've gotten to the same conclusion that Starbucks has gotten to. This program, the Certified Age-Friendly Employer Program, which I've referenced a couple times, is getting bigger every year. A little while ago, we celebrated our 15th anniversary. And I'm now happy to say it's in pretty much every sector. So it's in the nonprofit, for-profit, and policy sector, but also in every industry. Some industries were much slower to join the party, like the tech sector and the creative sectors were much slower to adopt this, but we're seeing more and more adoption now among those types of employers. And they join because they want to be recognized, they want to attract talent, they want to keep talent, and they want to be increasingly good citizens in the communities where they do business. We work directly with employers. We also work with fabulous organizations like Kathy's, who help us get introduced to those organizations. And I'm really happy to say one of the sectors that's gotten a lot of attention recently in the last 2 or 3 years is the government sector. So the state of Massachusetts, frankly, led the way by saying, we want to ask our Massachusetts employers to do this, but we can't really do that unless we lead by example and get the state certified. So they did exactly that. We're hoping that New Jersey is going to be a quick follow on that, right, Kathy? Maine has followed suit. Just last week, the county of Los Angeles joined this, and so this is now happening more and more and more, and it's pretty much organically happening. I mean, obviously, we're helping to move some of these employers down this path, but the application rates into our organization have improved substantially. Government makes so much sense because if you look at the percentages of people over 50 working in government jobs, the percentages are just much higher than almost every other sector. So if you as an older worker is looking to be really welcomed, the chances are pretty good that working for the government is going to be a good spot for you. But obviously, it's many more sectors than just that. When we certify an employer, the whole program has been rooted in compensation and benefits and HR standards. We created the standards 17 years ago, and every year we hone them and change them, and we collect data back from employers. So they want to know where they stand. And, not surprisingly, if you are a New Jersey employer and you're in the insurance sector, you want to know what your insurance peers are doing. And if you're behind them, you want to catch up, or if you're ahead of them, you want to know that and boast about it a little bit. This drives employers too. If you knew an employer was designated as age-friendly, how much more likely would you, meaning employee or a job seeker, be to stay at the employer or to recommend the employer? And it's very compelling data. So when employers see this, they're really studying increasingly, because of the talent shortages, why people come to them and why people stay with them. And this is really compelling information. As I said, the industries covered are almost across the board now. Some, obviously index higher than others. This is, I guess, a table version of what Jan was showing earlier in more graphic form, but it also just points up for employers to understand better what's going on with their workforces. If you look at the younger workforce, the labor force participation rate by age is going down. If you look at the older adult workforce, the labor force participation rate is going up. So this is going to have an implication for you as an employer, and you might as well be in front of it. Where you see the biggest change in percentage points is in that 65 to 74 group. It goes from 20% to 31%. So it's an 11-point change over that period of time, and that's really significant. Finally, policymakers, they need a well-functioning economy. They want to think about it from a health perspective. They want their people to be healthy. They also want to know, frankly, what's it going to cost me to run Medicaid in my state? Up here in Massachusetts, the Medicaid line item is over 40%. And those people who study health and understand the preventative health benefits know that people working longer are healthier. And therefore, they're going to be, our older adults are going to be cheaper to, keep healthy if we keep them in the workforce. So this is one of the reasons at a macro level, they say, let's encourage this program. Let's also look at it from a GDP perspective. So when we first started this program, one of the organizations to embrace it right away was the US Senate Aging Committee. And their big point was, we love the economic security point, we love the health point, but we really love the GDP point. If that labor force participation rate, as Jan showed us, continues to go up, and by the way, it will on its own, but if we make it go up even faster, that's only going to help GDP. That's the economic output. That just makes us that increases the tax revenue. And at the end of the day, the states opt to manage their P&L just like any other organization. And not for nothing, but governors and mayors and lots of other politicians do like to get votes, and people who are older tend to vote at a higher rate. This is the Massachusetts governor, former Massachusetts governor, Charlie Baker. I will give him credit for one of his slogans was he wanted to make Massachusetts the Silicon Valley for innovation and aging. And he really led the way. His background was in healthcare, and he's the one who really championed a lot of the work. I think Jan and I both feel fortunate to be doing the work that we do in this state, where this has been a highly prioritized topic. Jan and I both had substantial involvement with the Governor's Council to address aging, and this was one of his priorities. And I think it is fair to say it's a really important priority. And he said this over and over and over again. So he took the lead and got Massachusetts designated as an age-friendly employer. Marty Walsh, until recently the Secretary of Labor, also embraced it, leaned into it, and said, this is a new national model. And that's been one of the reasons that other states have followed. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this next section. I'm going to begin to wrap up and see if there might be some questions for Jan and me. But I'm going to just give you a couple of examples of sort of older adults in the workforce, because this is not older adults in the workforce. It's just, there's everyone's different, and there's lots of different people with different needs and different backgrounds and different economic levels. So there's different types of, different types. And I'll show you a few examples. Obviously it's a new world out there. People over 50, once viewed as on their way out, are being viewed a different way. Finally, there's some things going on for some of the reasons I mentioned. This happens to be my wife. She's a former TV news executive. She became a teacher later in life. Her aspiration is to get a PhD, and She went about getting a master's on her path to that. Here's an enterprise salesperson. Learning was a big part of the objective here, going back to school. That's not required, but it certainly helps people make transitions. Here's someone who wanted to be an entrepreneur and got an MBA in the process. Here's someone who got a gerontology degree to make a switch. And here's someone who is looking for some vocational skills to end up in a new path. So I started with, do you know a slungo? And here's what a slungo is. I want to make the point that the fact that it's hard sometimes for older adults to get work is not always because the employers are biased. It's sometimes because the older job seekers are a slungo, meaning they're stubborn and set in their ways, or they're still living in the 70s, or they can't take direction from a younger manager, or they're not going to stay up to date on tech, or they're just a little bit grumpy and ornery. And they're at least perceived as being overpaid or entitled. And I think we've all seen this. I'm not going to suggest by any means that this is what the entire market looks like, but it's a real thing, and we can't ignore the fact that a lot of older adults need to be taught that they need to be the opposite of those things. So just to wrap up, the thesis here, working longer solves almost everything for those three different groups. And I will end there and say thank you again for inviting me to speak.
Thank you. And if any of you are working in an organization that you think would like to go through the CAFE program and be certified, please shoot me an email. You might be the first in New Jersey, but what I loved when I first met Tim was that the state of Massachusetts was leading by example. That's something that we will aspire to in New Jersey. Might take a little while. Is anybody here working with the state? And hopefully that we can do that, because we have committed to becoming an age-friendly state, and it starts at the top, like you said. So does anybody have questions? His contact? Yeah, I'm the one that was on the seat. Yeah, I'm Kathy. I was on all the emails, so you find me there, and I can connect you with Tim too if you have questions about it. And any other live? Go ahead. So someone who's retiring due to what? Oh, to health related problems. What are some of the opportunities that you see for them, job wise or volunteer wise? If they have a health condition that is something that a health condition would be a consideration for them.
Is the question what types of jobs are available to people who have health constraints? Is that the question? I mean, if it's mobility type of constraint, let me see what the question is.
Okay. Right. If, for example, they had to be at home because of their health, or they couldn't be full time.
Yeah.
Do what they used to do probably before COVID because of their health.
Yeah, I would say, it's astounding to me how many customer service jobs have moved into the home. It used to be in that field, people would go to a very, very large, building and work among hundreds of other people next to them in cubicles. And during COVID, those jobs got moved home, and a lot of them stayed there. So that's one category that's a really big one. Another big one is tutoring, and these are both work at home jobs that are completely different styles and pay grades, but they're both, there's a high volume in both of those examples, and there's many more examples.
And that might be the kind of transition job that you talked about, getting out of what you had done before and transitioning to a new field. Any other questions? Margaret, who just retired, you don't have a question? Margaret has been coming for 25 years, well, at least 10 years for our conferences, and today she has retired and is here just for the fun of it.
Congratulations.
You have a question? Oh. Hmm. Okay. So do you know, what would be the legal recourse for somebody who wants to work, but because of the health or mobility issues can no longer work in the old setting full-time or, and the employer doesn't accommodate them? Because a cafe employer would accommodate someone like that. What is the legal recourse if the employer won't?
Well, I would start with the ADA because the ADA compliance is so much easier to prove than workforce age discrimination. Which is
Huh.
very hard to prove. And so, you know, and the ADA has done a lot to educate employers that they need to accommodate people with different needs. And so I would start there. I actually don't know if there's something called ADA friendly because everyone's supposed to be ADA friendly, but I think that I would start there. I mean, age discrimination laws are really tricky, and yes, you can engage a lawyer if you think you're seeing obstruction, but I just am not very optimistic most of the time that you're going to get very far with that path.
But ADA compliance is easier, or just mobility and ADA non-compliance is easier to point to than age discrimination.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the whole point of the cafe list, the whole point is, age friendly is really the polar opposite of age biased. And so our goal with that whole program at the very beginning, and it remains one of the key goals today, is to save you time if you're a little bit older in first knocking on the door of an organization more likely to welcome you than to shun you. And that's the shunning is still happening every day in America. It's not good. It is changing, not fast enough, but that's the point of that list, is to start there.
Anyone else? No. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for accommodating us and being remote. I think it worked pretty well. And we hope to have you back again soon. Thanks to you too, Jan.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you all.